Hi, everybody. I'm still Martha Minow. I'm still the dean. And every now and then I get to do something that I really, really want to do. And one of the things I really, really wanted to do was to convince Nancy Ramirez, one of my favorite students, to come back and teach. And so we had wonderful conversations, and Nancy worked out a fabulous course, and it was all lined up. And she said, I do have to tell you one thing. I'm under consideration to be appointed to be a judge. I said, well, that's very nice, and if that happens, then you won't teach the class. But I'm still counting on you teaching the class, and then she got appointed to be a judge. So that's what happened. So this wonderful story leads actually to a win-win, which is I said, would you still be willing to come spend a week with us? And here she is. So it is my great, great delight and pleasure to introduce to you Commissioner Nancy Ramirez. She is currently a commissioner in the Los Angeles Superior Court after serving at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the leading Latino civil rights law firm in the country, serving in a role that I guess I can only describe as the guide of the litigation and public policy strategy in the Western states. And so we're going to talk about her life and her work. And I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, but I'm going to begin with, how did you get to law school? What happened before then?
You know, that's a really good question. I grew up in Monterey Park, California, which is in Los Angeles in the San Gabriel Valley, and I'm the oldest of 4 daughters. My parents sent us to Catholic schools. I was a stay-at-home mom. My dad was a civil engineer. My mom's a Mexican immigrant, and they always valued education. And my dad has always told me and my sisters to, don't be the nurse, be the doctor. Get your education, go. It was always about get your education, go to college, go to college. So my parents were always reading the newspaper, and growing up I would always read about MALDEF and the work that MALDEF was doing. And I just left an impression on me. When I went to college, I was a community college transfer student. I went to UC Berkeley. I had never really imagined myself as an attorney. I always wanted to do something that was helping people. I thought maybe social work. And I started meeting students who were going to law school and talking about how they wanted to be lawyers. And I thought, well, I never thought I could do that. And then I started volunteering at legal service organizations. There's one in San Francisco called La Raza Centro Legal. Volunteered there. I got exposure. And I realized, this is something that I would like to do. And so I, in addition, and this is something that, I just recently realized, part of my judicial application, they asked a lot of questions, like what skills do you bring, what would make you a good judicial officer, and it prompted me to really think back about why I ended up in public interest work. And I realized that a lot of it had to do with my mom. So my mom is, she is the oldest in her family, and she is fluent in English and Spanish. She's a naturalized United States citizen. And when she was 17, she had to leave home. Her mother had died when she was young. She came to Los Angeles to work. She sent money back home, supported her family, and she was always there to support her family in other ways. So when I was growing up, I would see her helping her immigrant relatives, cousins, extended family, go with them to the LA County General Hospital, be their interpreter, sit there with them all day. She would go with them to the federal building for their immigration interviews.
Be their advocate.
Exactly. She wrote letters for them on their behalf when they got scammed by some consumer scams. And I realized that that is really what had a huge influence on my decision to pursue work on behalf of the Latino community. I think my mom's was my first role model, and seeing her advocate on their behalf. So
long story, that's how I ended up in law.
Well, then, in addition to thanking you for being here, I thank your mom. That's really fabulous. I don't want to make you dwell on your time as a law student, but is there anything that happened while you were a law student that you found yourself drawing on in your later career?
There's a lot of things, I think, that I drew on. One of the things that I did as a law student was really try to make change at the law school. And when I was here in the late 80s, we had no Latino professors, we had no Latino law journal, and I was part of a class that was one of the largest at that time in terms of admitted students who were Latino. And we really, coming from the Southwest in particular, everywhere you look, the demographics, it's a highly Latino state. California, Los Angeles is a very Latino city. And we just felt that there was, and I'm from Los Angeles, but people from Texas, New Mexico, from all over, Arizona. And we didn't feel that what we saw at the law school was reflective of our realities back home. And so we thought as a leading legal institution, it would be very important to have a journal that would focus on some of those types of issues. And so we organized around those. We had, I think, a study-in for faculty diversity, and that experience really helped me to develop my leadership skills. And I look back at that in the sense that I was able to come into a new institution not really knowing anything about it and having to learn how to navigate to make change. And I did draw on that as I entered my career in law and, developed my own leadership skills later. But it was really a good place for me to develop leadership skills.
When you graduated, well, actually, let's talk about your work as for Congresswoman Sanchez. What was that? What did that involve?
So I have had a kind of a circuitous career path. I didn't stay with the law for the entire time. So my work with Sanchez, I had been at MALDEF for 5 years, and I was so idealistic when I was younger, and I was very discouraged because I was a voting rights attorney at the time. There was a lot of Supreme Court decisions coming out that were curtailing the Voting Rights Act. Shaw versus Reno was one of them, and we had some great cases, but we had wrong judges for our cases, and that even though we had the law and the facts on our side, we were still losing all of our motions, and I felt discouraged by that. And so when Congresswoman Loretta Sanchez was elected, she was the first Democrat and woman and Latino/Latina ever elected to Congress in Orange County, and it was very inspirational to me. And I was at a time when I was looking to do something different and maybe do politics as a way to make change. So I was hired as her district director, so I ran her local congressional office, and I was a liaison to a number of groups. She had a number of constituency groups that she focused on: senior citizens, the Latino community, law enforcement, local government, and I supervised the various other staff in her office. But that was a really great experience because I learned a lot about politics, and I got to go to DC and work as the director of her Washington, DC office. But I also realized that there were a lot of compromises that had to be made, a lot of money that was involved, that people have told me throughout the years, why don't you run for office? And like, that's just not my thing, and I've had a chance to kind of get it out of my system. And but it was a really, it was a lot of fun. I got to meet Al Gore. My sister got to drive in the motorcade when he came to town, so it was fun.
Well, I wanted to get that on the table first because now I want to really take you through your time at MALDEF, although you also, and let's talk about that too, were the executive director of the Los Angeles Center for Law and Justice. But MALDEF, you spent the bulk of your career. and initially as a staff attorney in voting rights. And then when you came back, a broader portfolio. So tell us about what the work day-to-day is like, and how strategy is set, and how it compares to politics. So those are the kinds of questions.
So day-to-day, it differs. When I had a staff of about 6 lawyers, and I guess there was about 10 staff that I was supervising. Everyone was doing different cases, different work, and it was a really dynamic time of trying to stay on top of all of the work that each lawyer was doing in terms of supervising, but also making sure that the type of and the quality of the legal work was, we were being effective in what we were doing. And I mentioned this to the students before. In 2009, it was an economic downturn, and I had to lay off half of my staff.
Yeah.
And we had to close a couple of our offices. I mean, they were offices that we did legislative work. We only had 1 or 2 staff people, but we took a big hit, and it changed after that. It wasn't as many people, and we really had to sort of refocus our work on just the cases that pretty much a skeletal staff of attorneys could handle. But a lot of times, in terms of the strategy, a lot of times we were reacting to all the things that were going on around us. So it wasn't like we had time to sit and say, you know, where should we be going? Where should we be filing lawsuits? Although that is an important part of what we do, but there's so much coming out of Arizona that we just can't keep up with it. And you know, one of the goals of MALDEF and the way MALDEF was set up was really to be to really leverage resources. You know, we don't do individual client cases. Our goal is to leverage the limited resources that we have to do impact litigation, to partner with other agencies, to partner with other attorneys, and that's a way to really expand the resources that we have. And so that's what we have been doing.
Well, a couple of the enormous accomplishments that you've done under real constraints include the representation of victims of police misconduct in a very visible way following an immigrant rights rally. Your work in the Title VI national origin discrimination lawsuit against a school district when the teacher singled out a student and berated a student based on her national origin. And one that's dear to my heart, your role in Fisher versus Tucson Unified School District, where against all of the national trends, you convinced the Ninth Circuit to reverse a finding that the schools had achieved unitary status, that they had become desegregated, and instead they remanded and said, no, you're not. So, I mean, amazing accomplishments, truly. And I would really love to know just what role do facts play in those kinds of successes? What role do witnesses play? What role does the law play?
So facts are, I think, play a huge role. And in the Tucson case, which is, I have to say, of all my work at MALDEF, that's one of my favorite cases that I've had the privilege to work on. And just a little bit of background is MALDEF filed that lawsuit in 1974. It was a desegregation lawsuit following another lawsuit filed on behalf of African American students. And over the year, there was a settlement in 1978, and over the years, the school district was to comply with the terms of the settlement, report on the progress it was making in terms of integrating its schools and improving the educational achievement of the students. Well, for whatever reason, the case kind of fell through the cracks. I mean, it had been settled. There was no accountability. Nobody was really checking on the
compliance.
The compliance. And so flash forward to the early 2000s, and the school district says, we want to get out from under this case. It's been going on for 30-some years. So they ended up briefing why they should not be considered unitary. And long story short, the district court judge said, okay, even though you still haven't complied with these 12 factors, you have a plan in place, and I'm going to take it on faith you're going to comply with it. So I'm closing this out and declaring you unitary. And that's what the Ninth Circuit reversed. And the end result is that we now have a special master who, with the attorneys on the case, drafted a unitary status plan. And I had the privilege of playing a role in that. And one of the things, and I guess I'm kind of veering off in a different direction, but one of the things that was so rewarding to me about working on that case is that I was able to help fight to get Mexican American Studies back in Tucson Unified. So the bigger picture in Arizona is that the state had passed a law banning certain ethnic studies. And the way the law was framed was such that it banned courses that promote the overthrow of the government. And I can't remember all of the specific provisions of that, but that was one part of it. And so Tucson Unified School District had a Mexican American Studies program. It had African American Studies, and Asian American Studies, and a Native American Studies program, where after it had determined that it needed to do more to help improve these students' educational achievements. And those programs had been in place since the late 90s. That being so, the only program under attack was Mexican American Studies. And it's my belief that the legislation that was passed, the quote-unquote anti-ethnic studies law, it's my belief that that was intended specifically to dismantle the Mexican American Studies at Tucson Unified. So there was a lot of so what happened was the school district was under pressure to suspend those courses because Tom Horn, who was the superintendent of schools, who's now the attorney general, he had threatened to withhold state funding of the Tucson Unified School District of millions of dollars because they were continuing to teach these classes that he deemed were illegal. And so the school board, under pressure from the state, voted to suspend all teaching of Mexican American Studies courses, and that way they wouldn't have their funding withdrawn. So that's right around the time when I joined this case, and I was so fired up to do whatever I could with my co-counsel to bring the courses back. And the way we were able to do it is that because Tucson Unified had been under a desegregation plan prior to, well, let's just say the plan that was in place at the time that the school district voted to suspend the courses required Tucson Unified to not only offer Mexican American Studies, but to expand those courses. And they were offered in different ways to elementary, middle, and high school. Of course, their focus is different at each level. And even though that was a part of the post-unitary status plan at the time, the school board voted to suspend it. So we went in with a strategy saying, this is part of your obligation to desegregate the school district. You cannot just suspend these courses. It's part of this deseg plan.
So the relationship between law and legislation and politics is at the center here.
Yes.
Very much so. Did you, in any case, have a strategy that involved the media or that involved, activities outside of the courts?
Absolutely. Every case you do involves the media. We all get training on how to work with the media. In fact, when you're deciding, when you're looking for clients or plaintiffs or class representatives, you're also looking at how is this person going to play in the media.
Sure. And who can tell the story?
Exactly. What is their story? What's their background in terms of, you know, their family story? Is it a positive one that's going to really help move your strategy forward? And you know, you learn how to write press releases, you do press conferences. You also have to check with your client to make sure they're okay with that, because some people, one, they're already afraid to be involved with a lawsuit, and then you say, by the way, when we file the complaint next week, we're going to do a big press conference, and can you be present? A lot of times they're very nervous, and sometimes they waffle, but eventually they want to be a part of it, because that is part of our strategy in advocacy, is sending a message. You're sending a message not just to the wrongdoer, to the school district, to the sheriff's office, but you're also letting them know, we're watching, we're going to enforce the law, you're not going to get away with this. But you're also sending a message to the community members that we're here, we've got your back, we're on your side, they're not going to get away with this. And so that's an important part of the work that we do.
Well, I have 3 more questions, and then I'm going to invite others to ask questions or make comments. And the first is, you did leave at one point to become executive director of the Los Angeles Center for Law and Justice, where the work included consumer protection, domestic violence. Are those civil rights matters? How do you conceive of that kind of work?
I think that those are, I do see them as civil rights in a certain sense. I think they're human rights matters. Working with individual clients was extremely rewarding, and it's different from impact litigation. I have this discussion with my attorney friends who've worked in both direct legal services and in impact, and I have concluded that that type of work is just as valuable and just as important and can have a big impact, because you're not just dealing with that one individual, but there is a ripple effect in terms of their family. And you're educating them not just about what the law says and what's appropriate and not appropriate, or legal and not legal, but you're also educating them about how important it is for them to stand up for themselves, and for them to, that they deserve a certain amount of respect and dignity that they didn't get when they were defrauded or when they were harmed by their partner. And that also has a huge impact on improving their life and improving their children's lives, and hopefully trying to stop that cycle of violence.
And maybe stopping the larger patterns because the law is being enforced. So when you, my next question is that you go back to MALDEF, and the world is not getting better. So immigration questions, voting rights questions, where are we now on immigration? These are my last 2 questions. And where are we now on voting rights?
Well, on immigration, we are waiting for our Congress to pass immigration reform. And in the meantime, you have a patchwork of immigration laws, well, immigrant-related laws in the states. And California is a state that has gone from passing Proposition 187 in 1994, which was the first anti-immigrant statewide ordinance, as far as I know, that was sort of the historical
memory. Right. And to now passing more immigrant-friendly legislation, such as allowing undocumented higher ed students to have access to financial aid, driver's license. In addition, you have states determining for their own how they're going to deal, like Arizona. Arizona's decided it doesn't matter if we have a federal mandate called DACA that requires work permits and driver's license to eligible participants. We're still going to deny these students a driver's license. So we have a patchwork of states trying to fill in those gaps at the federal, that are existing at the federal level. And with regard to voting rights, we also are looking at the Shelby decision from 2 years ago that dismantled a huge tool in
pre-clearance
in civil rights. And that tool now, my understanding, and I have not been part of these discussions, but there is a coalition of civil rights groups that are in the process of putting together some sort of plan or legislation that would be able to address some of the criticisms that the Supreme Court has made in terms of how onerous Section 5 was, and maybe it needed to be a little bit more flexible. And it seems like they're working hard to try to come up with some sort of legislative solution for that. But what I've been hearing and reading is that there's been sort of a positive backlash as a result, because now people are saying, you don't have this protection anymore, you don't have this tool, and you got to get out and vote. And it's even more important today that you participate in the electoral process, and hopefully that will get more people to participate. But these issues continue to be to need good minds, to need good litigation strategies, and just like I was sitting where you all are 24 years ago, I am confident that a lot of these problems are not going to go away, and you will be at the forefront of coming up with new solutions and new strategies, and you're in a great place to learn how to do that. And I encourage you to take advantage of your professors, which I didn't do enough of. Dean Minow, I went to her in office hours because I felt comfortable. And here I am today. I never would have thought, my going to office hours and visiting with my professor would turn into a visit back to Harvard Law School. But take advantage. This is a premier institution, and there's a lot of great minds here. There's a lot of resources, and take advantage of what you have to really figure out how to come up with solutions for today's problems.
Great. So questions? Who wants to ask a question? Somebody may want to ask about what it's like to be a judge. That might be an interesting thing to learn about. Shelby County, in case people don't know the details of that case, was a challenge to a provision in the civil rights law that required the Department of Justice to approve redistricting plans in communities that had had a history of voting rights violations. And the Supreme Court decided that, that the formula that was used to decide which communities required that kind of preclearance was out of date, even though the Congress had only recently reenacted the law and had looked at it in not a short span of time, in a short span of time. So it's really thrown the community, civil rights community, back into legislative solutions. That's exactly right. Who has a question? And just identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Jessica Lewis. I'm in 1L. There was recently an editorial that basically said that if Republicans didn't garner one Hispanic vote, it wouldn't matter because they would still retain control of the House. What do you think that people can do to make sure that their voices are heard given that information?
I tend to be an optimist, and I think that it's so important for everyone to, first of all, if you are not a citizen and you are eligible to be a citizen, to become a citizen and to register to vote and to vote. And that's just such a fundamental part of our democracy. And I see how, in particular, in Southern California, in California as a state, the Latino electorate has really come alive. And a lot of it was as a result of Proposition 187, which was so harmful, it was so polarizing. But the end result is that a lot of people woke up and they said, you know what, I am not a U.S. citizen, I'm going to become a U.S. citizen, I'm going to vote. It was a result of, in the churches, at least in the Catholic churches, the priests telling their immigrant constituents, you need to do something about this type of law, and the only way you can change it is to get out and register and become a citizen. And I have seen California go from maybe a 7% Latino voter registration rate to it's now in, I believe, the 20s, maybe more. And a lot of the positive legislation that we're seeing out of the state of California, the immigrant-friendly, I think has a lot to do with a new face of elected representatives there. And so I know I'm focusing on a state level, but everything starts at home. And it's so important to get involved at the state level because there will eventually be, I believe, an impact nationwide. But it all starts at home. And even if it looks like futile, people still have to participate.
Hi, thanks for speaking with us.
Say who you are.
I'm Danielle Young. I'm a first year. And I wanted to ask you about how you approach shaping a career with a view towards potentially becoming a judge. On our first day here, they advised us to clean up our Facebooks and not to step out of line. But I'm sure there's much more to it. So I'm curious, particularly where there's an attitude that judges are supposed to always be neutral. How do you approach crafting your career where you do have very clear values and commitments politically as well?
So I hesitate because I've always just done what I wanted to do, and I never said, I want to be a judge one day. I just did what I loved, what made me excited, what got me up out of bed in the morning and excited to work. And that's always worked well for me. And I don't know that judges are necessarily neutral. I think judges have to follow the law. But one thing I've learned since I've been in, and my position is technically as a commissioner, is that you can get the same set of facts. You can have 4 different judicial officers look at those facts and come out with 4 different outcomes, decisions, and rationales for them. So, and a lot of times it's based on their value system. So I guess my advice is to follow your passion and of course keep, if you hold to certain tenets, then you will be fine. And that is, always be ethical. Treat people with respect. It doesn't matter if you have a jerk of an opposing counsel. You treat that person professionally. You treat your clients professionally. You are forthright with your pleadings. If you know that there's a case or fact that's not in your favor, you just put it out there and let the judge know, look, there's this law that goes against us. However, we still have all these other things. Being honest, having integrity, and that's really what you need, because sometimes if you have all those things and you follow your passion, you're going to land on your feet. One of the other things, too, I've learned in this judicial application process is you go way back in time and you have to put every, 20 cases you worked on, every lawyer who worked on the case with you, every opposing counsel, every judge, their address, their phone number, they contact them. And so if you have not followed those tenets, it's going to come out. And so that's why it's really important that all of that comes back to you. But if you're passionate about what you're doing, you're going to do a good job, you're going to work hard, and that's what's going to propel you forward.
Hi, my name's Dane Lee. I'm a 1L from Los Angeles. I come from a mixed status family, so one of my dreams is to participate in impact litigation that kind of creates a right to counsel for people in deportation proceedings. So my first question is, do you see sort of a strategy or a path that will get that kind of litigation on the table, or that kind of outcome on the table? But also, for young attorneys who want to participate in, civil rights and immigrant rights impact litigation, how do we get started? How do we learn how to, do it?
Okay, so for your second question, make sure that you do spend your summers doing work with organizations that do that kind of work. You're going to learn a lot. Take advantage of externship opportunities in law school, things that you can do during the semester, whether it's Jamaica Plain or clinical. I know I believe there's an immigration clinic. So there's practical things, it takes time to learn all these things, and you have to build on each experience. And with regard to a strategy for a right to counsel in deportation proceedings, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You have a vision, and you have an opportunity to try to make that vision a reality and stay focused on that. But in terms of how to do it, I know that the immigration laws are very complex. They've been compared to the Internal Revenue Code. But there has been, I know that with the unaccompanied minors, there's I'm not that familiar with the law, but I know that there is, I believe it was the legislation that was approved by President Bush that provided some sort of right to counsel or advice before the unaccompanied minors go through their immigration proceedings. There's also been some new developments with regard to the overlap between criminal and immigration law, because I believe it was U.S. Supreme Court decision where required that if you have a person who's been accused of certain criminal acts and they're an immigrant, you can't just stay focused solely on the criminal defense. You have to look at what are the immigration implications. And I think that there are certain avenues where they're sort of thinking more about the consequences of representation and adequate representation and guidance in the law. And perhaps there's some way, that you can go with some of those ideas and see if there's a way to build on it. And another thought, in California, Governor Brown just signed a law that would provide $3 million in funding to legal service organizations to do representation for unaccompanied minors. And so there are some movements in that direction, but I would encourage you to really look further into that.
So Phil Torrey is a clinical instructor here and teaches a course on crimmigration, following on what you said, and he would be a good person to consult, as well as Debbie Anker, who runs the Immigration Refugee Clinic. So there are opportunities while you are here, and I think there's a connection between what you just said and what you said to the prior question, which is follow what you're really interested in while you're here. And you'll build a portfolio of experiences that will allow you a basis to make the career that you want to have. Yes?
Marco Medellin, I'm also a first year. My question is regarding MALDEF. It's the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. But do you feel a responsibility towards other Latino-based groups? And if so, how do you deal with competing interests within the same ethno-racial umbrella?
Okay, so historically, MALDEF is Mexican American. It was formed in 1968 at a time when the Southwest was primarily Mexican American. Over time, the Latino community has broadened. In the 70s and 80s, you had huge immigration from Central America. And if you look at certain urban areas, Los Angeles, Salvadoran, Guatemalan, Nicaraguan, there's very diverse Latino groups. So the work of MALDEF is really immigrant focused, and so that's not specific to Mexican American. And the work we do has been to work with all of the immigrants that are impacted with a Latino focus. And then the other part of your question was
if there's intergroup conflict.
How do you deal with if there are competing interests within the same ethno-racial groups?
So what I would say would be competing interests are not so much among different immigrant groups, because I think regardless of whether you're from one country or another, if you're an immigrant, you do have a lot that you share in common. I would say that there might be a difference between the people who have more assimilated and who have been here longer and who, maybe for generations, and their issue is not necessarily immigration reform. Their issue is education and jobs. And MALDEF does that work as well. You know, we represent people who have suffered through employment discrimination or were not promoted. We had a big case against the police department for failure to promote Latino officers. And that is not so much an immigrant concern. You're talking about people who are more assimilated. So I think MALDEF has been aware of those differences, but the work that we do covers all of those different areas.
And the regional office that you headed works in education, employment, voting rights, and immigration rights. And as I understand it, regardless of whether people from Mexico or from another country, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you. Sure.
Hi, my name is Marissa Benavides. I'm a 2L. Thank you so much for being here this week. I'm pretty curious as to both your judicial tenure and probably as a lawyer as well, if there were any elements of kind of xenophobia in the cases you've handled or adjudicated, and how do you address those elements when they're sometimes rational, maybe sometimes rational, but do you have a strategy for kind of dealing with that when it comes up?
So you say xenophobia in what sense?
In the sense of just fear of immigration, fear of people from another country.
Oh, just in general.
More generally,
that's prompting
yes.
a lot of these anti-immigrant measures and how we deal with that. Well, I think part of that is how we utilize our media strategy.
Okay.
And there's a group called the Opportunity Agenda that's headed up by Alan Jenkins, who's a Harvard Law graduate. And part of the work that they do is they do focus groups, they do surveys, and they come up with ways to message in a way that is, people are more receptive to those messages. In particular, how you message dealing with representing immigrants. And I've been to some of those workshops where they actually give you, phrases and say, this is how, when you're at a press conference or you're talking to the media or you're putting out a press release and you're talking about how you're going after these anti-immigrant measures, there's more public support if you couch it this way. And I think that's also an important part of the work we do, is trying to get public support for doing the right thing and for seeing things. You're saying it's xenophobic. People don't like to think of themselves as being xenophobic, so you have to really frame it in a way where they can see, what's happening is not really right, and maybe if we explain it in these terms, it might resonate more and you might get more public support for it.
I'm so glad you mentioned Alan Jenkins and his work, and he was here last year. We'll get him back again. The same way that the companies that sell us, breakfast cereal that it has no nutritional value, have figured out a way to communicate. There really are very sophisticated techniques, and his organization is right at the cutting edge, looking at focus groups and also images and how people respond to images, how people respond to words. And it connects to your earlier comment that every case you're dealing with the media. It's really a set of tools that lawyers, any advocate, needs to understand now. And so I'm glad you mentioned him.
Hi, I'm Robin Ladd. I'm a 1L. I'd like to know how you'd advise those of us who may not have political power or be in your position to deal with the issues with the reversal of the Voting Rights Act, because it seems to me like, in torts, you're liable for prior viciousness, but the Supreme Court, I guess, has decided that doesn't apply to the Voting Rights Act. So how would you advise those of us who may not be in positions of power to make change with that?
Well, the way I see it is it's a long path. It's a long path to justice, for lack of a better word. And it takes a lot of small steps to get there. And each of those steps, you say that, I don't know if you use the words powerless, but you're not powerless. Every person can make a difference. And I mean, you're at Harvard Law School. You are going to graduate with a law degree. It's going to open up a lot of doors for you. And you are going to get experiences that are going to help propel you forward to whatever those goals may be. If it's, maybe you'll be on the Supreme Court. And we need to think about what we can do, and we need to think about how even small steps such as learning more about the case that you're concerned about, or learning more about the legislative process, and interning with a senator, or clerking for a Supreme Court justice, all of those things are going to help build your skills and your experiences, so that maybe 20 years from now, 30 years from now, you're going to be in a position to make decisions and have an impact on those things. But I would not say that you are powerless. You're at Harvard Law School. You're going to make a difference in the world. It takes time, though. It's not going to happen like that. It takes time.
The optimism that you demonstrate, but also the persistence and that you demonstrate, I think, are such great lessons. I also heard in your question how to battle the treatment of history and the distancing of history in the contemporary judiciary in particular. And I think that is a serious issue. I think it's related, though, to the opportunity agenda and similar efforts to try to figure out, well, so what does persuade people? If it doesn't persuade people anymore to say, this happened 50 years ago, then what does persuade people? Because if there's something wrong, then there's got to be a way to articulate why it's wrong and how it's wrong. That's at least what I hope. So I'm going to ask the question that nobody else asked. What's it like to judge cases? What's it like?
Well, I've been 2 months on the bench, and I really enjoy it. It's a very serious undertaking, because you have in your hands the ability to really make a decision that's going to highly impact a person's life. And what I do is child support, and I'm making orders on how much child support to order, or whether to determine somebody is the parent of a child. And there's a lot of people who are struggling financially, and they are wanting to support sometimes their children, but there's a guideline formula that you have to input their income and their timeshare with the child, and it spits out a number saying, okay, based on this, you can pay $600 a month for child support. And a lot of litigants will say, I want to support my kid, but I can't afford $600. That's my whole paycheck. And so I'm still learning how to, the discretion that I have. And while, yes, there's a guideline, you also have to look at the whole picture, and you look at how is this going to impact this person for the rest of their life. Are they going to be a good dad or a good mom if they have $100,000 in debt that they'll never get out from under? How are you going to be a good parent when you have so much debt? And I'm still learning the law, so I'm still learning when I have discretion and how much discretion I have. But it has been very rewarding. I found that a lot of my experiences doing work in the nonprofit sector, working with low-income clients, working with immigrant clients, it has all come to fruition on the bench, because those are the people who are appearing in front of me. And when I was hired, the judges that hired me said, we really value your public interest, your legal services background, because that's all we see in our courtroom are people who are low income and they don't know how to navigate the system. So we want more people who are going to be sensitive to that. And I was blown away by that. I thought they would want a blue chip law firm, partner or senior associate, somebody who had all that experience. But no, they really value the background of coming in, working with low-income communities and understanding where these folks are coming from. I think that's really beneficial, but it's also, I lose a lot of sleep because I think, did I do the right thing? That guy kept telling me he can't afford it, he's living out of his car. And the mom was telling me, I've been on my own, I got 2 jobs, I'm trying to support my teenage daughter. And, and I ordered him to pay $200. Like, oh gosh, was that the right thing? It really is. I struggle with it. And I talk to my fellow commissioners and they say, you know what, if you didn't struggle with it, you wouldn't be a good commissioner. That's right. It's important that you think about it and you really you understand the gravity of what you're doing.
Describe the demographics of the people coming before you, and you said the percentage that don't have lawyers and so forth.
So I'd say about 95% are self-represented, and about 97% are people of color.
Yeah. Well, they're very lucky to have you, and we are very lucky that you made the time to come back here. So please join me in thanking Nancy Ramirez.
Thank you. The privilege and the honor is all mine.